In this lesson, we're going to look deeper into this data fetching in Nuxt. We're going to look at some important arguments of the useFetch and useAsync data commands, such as the key, the pick, as well as we will look at the lazy keyword. So if we come over to our API documentation here for useAsync data, so remember that useFetch actually wraps around useAsync data. So these have the same or very similar function signatures. You can see that we get a lot of different options here. We can pass in a server, a lazy, some default data, a transform function. We can give it a pick argument, a watch source, as well as this immediate flag. So there's a bunch of different things that we can do to configure how our data is being fetched. But there's one option that's really important as part of this useAsync data function here is the key. So if you look in the documentation, what this key does is it lets us properly deduplicate the requests. Now, in earlier versions of the Nuxt 3 beta, they did provide a cache along with this, but that had some issues, and so it was actually removed for the stable release of Nuxt. So to be clear, there is no caching except for on that initial page render. However, that's not really much of a problem for us because we can pretty simply create our own cache. So we're going to do that. We're going to use session storage as our cache. And this is because cache invalidation is a very tricky subject and not something I really want to get into in this course. But with session storage, every new session gets completely wiped out. And so that's a pretty good way of clearing out the cache and invalidating it. So we're going to stick with that. So we'll use the use session storage composable, which works in the same way as the use local storage composable that we used previously in this course. We'll have to make sure to import storage serializers as well as import our lesson with path type. And so what we're doing here is, first of all, we're just sticking this URL inside of a string so we can use it in a few different places. And then we're calling the use session storage composable. We're going to use the URL as the key so that whenever we go to a new URL, it will be a different spot in the cache so that whenever we go back to the same URL, it will just retrieve that value from the cache. We're going to initialize this with null, and then this option we have to pass in because we're giving it a default value of null. The composable does not know automatically what object type we're going to be giving it. So we're just going to tell it we're using an object, and so when we give you an object, serialize it into a string to save in the session storage, and then when we want to get it back out of session storage, it has to take that string and then convert it back into an object. So if we gave it a default like this, then this is an empty object, and we wouldn't need to pass this in. It would automatically know, oh, this is an object, use the object serializer. But in our case, we want to initialize it to null because that simplifies things for us a little bit. And so then we just need to give it this hint. You'll also notice that we've got these funny little brackets here with the type in here. What this is doing is telling the composable that the type that we're using this with is the lesson with path type. And this is important because then the return type that comes back is a removable ref of type lesson with path. And so these angled brackets are basically you can think of them as type arguments. So if removable ref is a function, this type here is an argument to that function. So that sets up our use of the session storage. And now this lesson variable here is a removable ref. This is the type that the session storage returns back to us. So if this value already exists, then lesson will be the lesson that we've already got. But if we haven't yet fetched from that, then it will be null. So we need to check for this. And so our use fetch and error handling here needs to be updated a little bit. And so what we're doing here now is we first check to see if we've hit the cache. And if we have a cache miss, then we need to fetch that data. So when that happens, we can call this. And here we're giving useFetch a hint that we are actually going to get back this lesson with path, because if we don't, then because we're passing in URL as a variable, TypeScript isn't quite intelligent enough to know and to infer that this URL is of the lesson with path type. And so because we have this variable here, then we just need to give it a little bit of a helping hand here. And then we've got our error handling as before. And then the crucial step here is that once we've fetched that data, we need to put it into the cache. And so updating this lesson value here with the data that we got back from our API will set the value in the cache. Because remember, this is a reactive ref. And so anytime we update this value, it will update what's stored in the session storage. I've also added a little message here so that if we're retrieving it from the cache, we'll just print out a little message so that we know that. And at the very end, we'll return our lesson. All right, so now let's see this working. So if I go to chapter 1, we see that the request comes through. If I go to chapter 2, that request also goes through. But if I go back to chapter 1, we get no request. And in the console, it will say we're getting lesson 1 from the cache. And so if we click around a bunch more, we'll see lesson 3 was already in the cache because that was the first one that we loaded. And there we go. And all of this loading here is actually from this Vimeo script. And that's not really anything that we can cache locally. So that will always take a bit of time to load. Great. And so now we've got a pretty straightforward and basic cache for this endpoint. So I mentioned this key value that we have in this use async data. And you'll notice that over here, we're not actually using the key value anywhere. And this is because by default, useFetch and useAsync data will automatically generate the key for us based on the URL that we're using and the position of the call within the code. So most of the time, this does a great job for us. But if you do run into issues where data is being inconsistent, or you're suspecting that this deduplication is not happening, then we can pass in our own custom key. We can also use this pick parameter to only bring us the fields of the response object that we actually want to use. So many times when we're fetching data from an API, the object that's returned has dozens, perhaps even more data fields. And often we only need one or two of those fields. And so 80% of that data that's coming over the wire is a waste. And we're wasting bandwidth and slowing down our app unnecessarily. Well, with this pick field, we're able to specify that we only want these two fields. And when we're on the server side, this means that the amount of data that we are hydrating with our app is much smaller. And it also means that the data object here is much easier to work with because we don't have all of these extra fields that we don't need to pass around everywhere. So if we save this, and now that we've got cached here, I have to create a new session. You can see that we're loading the number, so this renders correctly, and we're loading the title of the lesson, so this renders correctly. But because we're not loading the video ID or anything else, we're not able to get anything more in our lessons. So not useful for us right now because we need all of the data that we're sending over. But a quick demo of how this pick function works nonetheless. The last option that I wanted to go through of the more important options is this lazy keyword here. Now, normally with this use fetch and use async data, we have to put in this await keyword because we're going to wait, and this promise is only going to resolve once our data comes in. But in some cases, we actually want to continue along our execution here. And instead of waiting for this whole thing to render, we actually would prefer to put in some sort of loading state. Maybe that's a spinner, maybe that's a progress bar, or whatever it might be in your case. If we set lazy to true here, we can get rid of this await keyword. And then we can use this pending property, which will tell us if the data is loaded or not. And then you can use this pending property to switch between your loading state and your normal state. And because this behavior is common enough, we actually get a shorthand for this. Instead of needing to provide that lazy true, we can just use the use lazy fetch or use lazy async data. But in our case, we want to wait until that data is fully there, and so we'll use it in this regular way here. And so if we come over here, you can see that we've got use async data, but we also have use lazy async data and then use lazy fetch. And so if you want to check those out further, you can find those on the documentation. Now, before we wrap up with this lesson, I do want to point out one more time, just to make sure that it's super clear, is that this use fetch method is a wrapper around use async data. And so all of the options that we can provide to use async data, we can provide to our use fetch command as well. And because use fetch uses that $fetch under the hood, we also get all of those options as well, including method, base URL, and so on. So now we've seen not only the basics of data fetching in Nuxt 3, but also some more advanced ways that we can control how our fetching works, including how we can build a simple but effective cache on top of our data fetching. In the next lesson, we're going to continue on and finish up our data fetching and fetch data from the course meta endpoint.